Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy with Mastering Color Grading in After Effects, and we're going to be moving on in this lesson to look at creating a specific look or style. Just switch this on to show you the end result. That's one end result. We've gone for a sort of old film look on this clip here. When you look at the original, it's very blue, very magenta, doesn't look right, looks cold and horrible. So we correct it and then we give it this sort of saturated yellowy look. From now on, when we've corrected footage, we're going to work with it creatively. Things start to get more interesting now. At this point, it's worth letting you know that you should probably change a couple of settings to get the best results. If you look down here where it says 8BPC and click that, over here in your color settings you can see you've got a depth of 8 bits per channel. Change that to 32. You'll get the best results. I'm going to leave that on 8 because it makes my system work faster. So I'm going to load the full interface and reset all so that we can see this from scratch. I'm going to go back to our RGB waveform as usual. However, to do this creative work, we're not just going to be working with the RGB tab as usual. We're going to instead have a look at the HSL tab, which is here at the very top. Some of the controls here are going to look very familiar. If you look at the master tab, we have pedestal, gamma and gain. It's called RGB gain, but it's the same thing. So I could just go in here and do the same work as usual, pull the pedestal down, take the gain up a fraction, play with the gamma. Our usual trick. I can go into the shadows and do the same thing, just as we would always do. So you may be wondering, if we can do that here, why do we do it in RGB? Some people would argue that you should do it in the HSL tab, hue saturation levels, because when Color Finesse processes visual information, it does it in a particular order. First of all, it does the levels, but we've not dealt with those yet, so just ignore that. Next, it goes to HSL, and then it processes RGB. So a lot of people argue that you should really do the HSL work first. The truth is, color correction is a balancing act, and it doesn't matter most of the time what order you do things in. And I'll show you why I prefer to use RGB first before we come back to the HSL. So I'll just reset all again. Back in the RGB tab. What I like about this is that we have all these color controls. Those aren't available in HSL. I like to be able to look at the scope and see that the blue is a little high, and I can bring that down. I just bring the blue gain down and maybe drop the blue pedestal, and why don't I shift the gamma as well? If you look at that image, it's getting quite close to being perfect already. Well, not perfect, but it's an improvement. I'll just reset that. If I was to try and do that in the HSL tab, yes, I can control the pedestal and the gain and the gamma, but I don't really have much control over the color. I can change things such as the hue, which gives an overall shift of all the colors. If you look at the waveform, you can see how crazily that changes everything. I can change the saturation, making it more saturated, less saturated. Very useful tool. I can change the vibrance, which affects the colors other than skin within reason. And then there's a brightness control and a contrast control and a contrast center, which changes where the contrast lies in the image. So there are lots of controls, but nothing for specifically controlling the color of the image. So for me, I would rather do the initial work in RGB and then once it's corrected, go to HSL. So I'll just do a very quick correction as we always do. It's no harm in revising this all the time because you need to see how it works on different shots. I'm now going to go into the shadows and just lift the shadows a little. The highlight's going to pull the gamma down, and in the midtones I might try and stretch the midtones a little, so lift the gain, drop the pedestal. Lift the blue pedestal in the master tab, pull the blue gain down. This is quite a tricky image. There's a green leaf, there's this strange 70s coloured dress in the background with it sort of purpley red and orange, And then there are the skin tones. Getting the skin tones right when there's so much purple around is difficult because you can see the knuckles are starting to look purpley. So I'm going to work with the red a little. Lift the red gain, drop the red pedestal, and just have a look at the gamma there, warms that up. I'm quite happy with that. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's a quick and reasonable correction. Let's do our old trick of looking at the source image, very blue and purpley and unusable. There's our result. That looks pretty good. In fact, I'm very happy with that. I'm just going to choose a suitable frame for the rest of the work. I think that's pretty good because we can see the green and the dress and the fingers are in focus. So basic correction done. Now we'll go to the HSL tab. So we've done that basic work with gain, gamma and pedestal. I don't need to do that here, but those controls are still there available for me if I want to do any additional work as I'm changing things here. Instead, I'm going to work with these other tools, hue, saturation, vibrance, and so on. You'll find that most people who work in color grading don't like to use tools such as brightness, contrast, and contrast center because, well, I'll just show you what happens. Brightness, it's a very crude tool. It brightens everything, and who would ever want to do that? Contrast, again, it's a brutal effect that is very rarely going to be useful to you. In small doses, you might use these. When you've done a bit of extra work, you might just nudge the brightness and drop the contrast. So it's good to have the tools there. But we're going to concentrate mostly on the hue, saturation, and vibrance. So I'm going to go to the shadows first and just play with the saturation to see what effects we can get. If I boost the saturation and the shadows there, that's quite interesting. I might just change the hue a little, see what we get. Oh, I like that. You see there we're heading towards, by just pulling the hue to the right, I've taken some of that extreme purple away from the skin tones, and the dress is looking sort of pleasantly orangey. It's not really affecting the leaf at all. Go to the midtones. I just push the vibrance up, see what happens. I don't really like the way that's affecting things, so I'll leave it where it is. I might try the saturation. I've just dropped the saturation there in the midtones, and that makes the skin look good. You'll notice as I'm doing this, I've not rehearsed this or practiced it. I'm color correcting on the fly to show you how you work. You experiment and you try things out and see what looks good. In the highlights, there, I wasn't expecting that. I nudged that to the right and I quite like how that looks. Let's try the saturation. I don't really want to change that. So that, again, I'm not really doing any massively creative work here. I'm just refining what we already have. To get even more creative, we go to the Hue Offset tab. This will look familiar if you've ever used any color correction filter before. Color wheels are always available in color correcting tools, and they're usually the first thing that people try and use. And they're often the reason that people give up on color grading. Because if you look here at the master wheel, and I click in the center and then drag out, and then you look at the image and it's changed color. It's not very useful. Wherever I drag, yes, I can add an overall color. You might want to do something like that if you're really going for an extreme look, but most of the time this isn't very useful. So people come to color grading and they try these wheels and they pull a few of the sliders in them around and they don't like what they get, and so they give up. That's why I've left the color wheels till now. Once you know more about color theory and how an image goes together, it's much easier to get a good result from these wheels. So you're going to get better results if you work with the shadows, midtones and highlights individually, and if you work in small increments, as always. So in the shadows, I'm going to click on the center of that wheel and just drag the shadows towards the yellowish area. You can see on screen, I'm not using the scopes now, but if you look at the image, you can just see how only the shadows have gone towards that yellow. You can circle right round by dragging and just see what different effects you get. That's a very interesting effect, but not what we really want. Over in the blue, that's quite ugly. You'll notice that when you add color to the shadows, if you do look at the scopes, some of the colors move right away from the zero pedestal line, and that's flattening them, it's reducing the contrast. So you might have to go back to the RGB or the HSL controls and work with your contrast again later. Or you may want coloured shadows. In fact, for this, I quite like coloured shadows. We're going for that 70s look, and in the 70s, the shadows were very rarely truly black. They had, if you look here, they had a sort of reddish, orangey tone in the dark areas. So I like what I've done with the shadows there. If we go into the midtones and click here, I don't really feel the need to change the midtones, because if you look what's happening, it's really the skin that's in the midtone area there. The dress is changing, the leaf is changing a little, but the skin is changing radically, and I don't like that. So I'm just going to undo it. Try with the highlights. Again, there's not much I want to do there. When you become experienced, you will get an instinct for what you need to do, but there's no harm in coming in and playing with these controls. When you're working quickly, which is nearly all the time, it's good to have an idea of what you want. So going for that 70s look, doing this to the shadows has really helped. I'm now going to go back to the Master tab and take everything over towards that yellowy look. And there we go. That's very close to what I want. Looking at the scope, we're crashing into the pedestal line and we've clipped in the red. So I'm going to go back to the RGB tab. I can allow things to clip here. If that's the look I want, I don't have to be too pedantic and say, right, well, that red gain's got to come down. Because if I do that, we've lost the colour that we just created. Just drag through the clip to see that it works all the way through. And click OK. So now you've got a reasonable understanding of how to correct in RGB and then do some creative work in the HSL tab. In the next lesson, I'll show you some more creative ideas for using colour to create specific looks and grades.